Chapter 6. Jeserac sat motionless within a whirlpool of numbers. The first 1,000 primes, expressed in the binary scale that had been used for all arithmetical operations since electronic computers were invented, marched in order before him. Endless ranks of ones and zeros paraded past, bringing before Jeserac's eyes the complete sequence of all those numbers that possess no factors except themselves and unity. There was a mystery about the primes that had always fascinated man, and they held his imagination still. Jeserac was no mathematician, though sometimes he liked to believe he was. All he could do was to search among the infinite array of primes for special relationships and rules which more talented men might find incorporate in general laws. He could find how numbers behaved, but he could not explain why. It was his pleasure to hack his way through the arithmetical jungle, and sometimes he discovered wonders that more skillful explorers had missed. He set up the matrix of all possible integers and started his computer stringing the primes across its surface as beads might be arranged at the inner section of a mesh. Jeserac had done this 100 times before, and it had never taught him anything. But he was fascinated by the way in which the numbers he was studying were scattered, apparently according to no laws, across the spectrum of the integers. He knew the laws of distribution that had already been discovered, but always hoped to discover more. He could scarcely complain about the interruption. If he had wished to remain undisturbed, he should have set his enunciator accordingly. As the gentle chime sounded in his ear, the wall of numbers shivered, the digits blurred together, and Jeserac returned to the world of mere reality. He recognized Kedron at once, and was none too pleased. Jeserac did not care to be disturbed from his ordered way of life, and Kedron represented the unpredictable. However, he greeted his visitor politely enough, and concealed all trace of his mild concern. When two people met for the first time in Diaspar, or even for the 100th, it was customary to spend an hour or so in an exchange of courtesies before getting down to business, if any. Kedron somewhat offended Jeserac by racing through these formalities in a mere 15 minutes, and then saying abruptly, "I'd like to talk to you about Alvin. You're his tutor, I believe." "That is true," replied Jeserac. "I still see him several times a week, as often as he wishes." "And would you say that he was an apt pupil?" Jeserac thought that over. It was a difficult question to answer. The pupil-tutor relationship was extremely important, and was, indeed, one of the foundations of life in Diaspar. On the average, 10,000 new minds came into the city every year. Their previous memories were still latent, and for the first 20 years of their existence, everything around them was fresh and strange. They had to be taught to use the myriad machines and devices that were in the background of everyday life. And they had to learn their way through the most complex society man had ever built. Part of this instruction came from the couples chosen to be the parents of the new citizens. The selection was by lot, and the duties were not onerous. Arestin and Etanya had devoted no more than a third of their time to Alvin's upbringing, and they had done all that was expected of them. Jeserac's duties were confined to the more formal aspects of Alvin's education. It was assumed that his parents would teach him how to behave in society and introduce him to an ever-widening circle of friends. They were responsible for Alvin's character, Jeserac for his mind. "I find it rather hard to answer your question," Jeserac replied. "Certainly there is nothing wrong with Alvin's intelligence, but many of the things that should concern him seem to be a matter of complete indifference. On the other hand, he shows a morbid curiosity regarding subjects which we do not generally discuss." "The world outside Diaspar, for example?" "Yes, but how did you know?" Kedron hesitated a moment, wondering how far he should take Jeserac into his confidence. He knew that Jeserac was kindly and well-intentioned, but he knew also that he must be bound by the same taboos that controlled everyone in Diaspar. Everyone except Alvin. "I guessed it," he said at last. Jeserac settled down more comfortably in the depths of the chair he had just materialized. This was an interesting situation, and he wanted to analyze it as fully as possible. There was not much he could learn, however, unless Kedron was willing to cooperate. He should have anticipated that Alvin would one day meet the Jester, with unpredictable consequences. Kedron was the only other person in the city who could be called eccentric, and even his eccentricity had been planned by the designers of Diaspar. Long ago, it had been discovered that, without some crime or disorder, Utopia soon became unbearably dull. Crime, however, from the nature of things, could not be guaranteed to remain at the optimum level which this social equation demanded. If it was licensed and regulated, it ceased to be crime. The office of Jester was the solution. At first sight, naive, yet actually profoundly subtle, which the city's designers had evolved. In all the history of Diaspar, there were less than 200 persons whose mental inheritance fitted them for this peculiar role. They had certain privileges that protected them from the consequences of their actions, though there had been jesters who had overstepped the mark and paid the only penalty that Diaspar could impose, that of being banished into the future before their current incarnation had ended. On rare and unforeseeable occasions, the Jester would turn the city upside down by some prank which might be no more than an elaborate practical joke, or which might be a calculated assault on some currently cherished belief or way of life. All things considered, the name Jester was a highly appropriate one. There had once been men with very similar duties, operating with the same license in the days when there were courts and kings. "It will help," said Jeserac, "if we are frank with one another. We both know that Alvin is a unique, that he has never experienced any earlier life in Diaspar. Perhaps you can guess, better than I can, the implications of that. I doubt if anything that happens in the city is totally unplanned, so there must be a purpose in his creation. Whether he will achieve that purpose, whatever it is, I do not know. Nor do I know whether it is good or bad. I cannot guess what it is." "Suppose it concerns something external to the city." Jeserac smiled patiently. The Jester was having his little joke, as was only to be expected. "I have told him what lies there. He knows that there is nothing outside Diaspar except the desert. Take him there if you can. Perhaps you know a way. When he sees the reality, it may cure the strangeness in his mind." "I think he has already seen it," said Kedron softly, but he said it to himself and not to Jeserac. "I do not believe that Alvin is happy," Jeserac continued. "He has formed no real attachments, and it is hard to see how he can while he still suffers from this obsession. But after all, he is very young. He may grow out of this phase and become part of the pattern of the city." Jeserac was talking to reassure himself. Kedron wondered if he really believed what he was saying. "Tell me, Jeserac," asked Kedron abruptly, "does Alvin know that he is not the first unique?" Jeserac looked startled, then a little defiant. "I might have guessed," he said ruefully, "that you would know that. How many uniques have there been in the whole history of Diaspar? As many as 10? 14, answered Kedron without hesitation, not counting Alvin. "You have better information than I can command," said Jeserac wryly. "Perhaps you can tell me what happened to those uniques?" "They disappeared." "Thank you. I knew that already. That is why I've told Alvin as little as possible about his predecessors. It would hardly help him in his present mood. Can I rely on your cooperation? For the moment, yes. I want to study him myself. Mysteries have always intrigued me, and there are too few in Diaspar. Besides, I think that fate may be arranging a jest beside which all my effort will look very modest indeed. In that case, I want to make sure that I am present at its climax. You are rather too fond of talking in riddles, complained Jeserac. Exactly what are you anticipating? I doubt if my guesses will be any better than yours. But I believe this. Neither you, nor I, nor anyone in Diaspar will be able to stop Alvin when he has decided what he wants to do. We have a very interesting few centuries ahead of us. Jeserac sat motionless for a long time, his mathematics forgotten, after the image of Kedron had faded from sight. A sense of foreboding, the like of which he had never known before, hung heavily upon him. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if he should request an audience with the council. But would that not be making a ridiculous fuss about nothing? Perhaps the whole affair was some complicated and obscure jest of Kedron's, though he could not imagine why he had chosen to be its butt. He thought the matter over carefully, examining the problem from every angle. After little more than an hour, he made a characteristic decision. He would wait and see. Alvin wasted no time learning all that he could about Kedron. Jeserac, as usual, was his main source of information. The old tutor gave a carefully factual account of his meeting with the jester, and added what little he knew about the other's mode of life. Insofar as such a thing was possible in Diaspar, Kedron was a recluse. No one knew where he lived or anything about his way of life. The last jest he had contrived had been a rather childish prank, involving a general paralysis of the moving ways. That had been 50 years ago. A century earlier, he had let loose a particularly revolting dragon which had wandered around the city, eating every existing specimen of the works of the currently most popular sculptor. The artist himself, justifiably alarmed when the beast's single-minded diet became obvious, had gone into hiding, and not emerged until the monster had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. One thing was obvious from these accounts. Kedron must have a profound understanding of the machines and powers that ruled the city, and could make them obey his will in ways which no one else could do. Presumably, there must be some overriding control which prevented any too ambitious jester from causing permanent and irreparable damage to the complex structure of Diaspar. Alvin filed all this information away, but made no move to contact Kedron. Though he had many questions to ask the jester, his stubborn streak of independence, perhaps the most truly unique of all his qualities, made him determined to discover all he could by his own unaided efforts. He had embarked on a project that might keep him busy for years, but as long as he felt that he was moving toward his goal, he was happy. Like some traveler of old, mapping out an unknown land, he had begun the systematic exploration of Diaspar. He spent his weeks and days prowling through the lonely towers at the margin of the city, in the hope that somewhere he might discover a way out into the world beyond. During the course of his search, he found a dozen of the great air vents opening high above the desert, but they were all barred, and even if the bars had not been there, the sheer drop of almost a mile was sufficient obstacle. He found no other exits, though he explored 1,000 corridors and 10,000 empty chambers. All these buildings were in that perfect and spotless condition which the people of Diaspar took for granted as part of the normal order of things. Sometimes, Alvin would meet a wandering robot, obviously on a tour of inspection, and he never failed to question the machine. He learned nothing because the machines he encountered were not keyed to respond to human speech or thoughts. Though they were aware of his presence, for they floated politely aside to let him pass, They refused to engage in conversation. There were times when Alvin did not see another human being for days. When he felt hungry, he would go into one of the living apartments and order a meal. Miraculous machines to whose existence he seldom gave a thought would wake to life after aeons of slumber. The patterns they had stored in their memories would flicker on the edge of reality, organizing and directing the matter they controlled. And so, a meal prepared by a master chef 100 million years before would be called again into existence to delight the palate, or merely to satisfy the appetite. The loneliness of this deserted world, the empty shell surrounding the living heart of the city, did not depress Alvin. He was used to loneliness, even when he was among those he called his friends. This ardent exploration, absorbing all this energy and interest, made him forget, for the moment, that mystery of his heritage and the anomaly that cut him off from all his fellows. He had explored less than 1/100th of the city's rim when he decided that he was wasting his time. His decision was not the result of impatience, but of sheer common sense. If needs be, he was prepared to come back and finish the task, even if it took him the remainder of his life. He had seen enough, however, to convince him that if a way out of Diaspar did exist, it would not be found as easily as this. He might waste centuries in fruitless search unless he called upon the assistance of wiser men. Jeserac had told him flatly that he knew no road out of Diaspar, and doubted if one existed. The information machines, when Alvin had questioned them, had searched their almost infinite memories in vain. They could tell him every detail of the city's history, back to the beginning of recorded times, back to the barrier beyond which the Dawn Ages lay forever hidden. But they could not answer Alvin's simple question, or else some higher power had forbidden them to do so. He would have to see Kedron again.